Welcome to the Ancestral Healing Podcast, a place where we explore ancestral healing, animism, and earth-based spirituality for personal, cultural, and planetary wholeness. I'm your host, Joseph Shumway, the Ancestral Healing Coach, bringing you some magic to reclaim vibrant connection with the earth, your ancestors, and the non-human world. Hello, friends. Welcome to the second episode of the Ancestral Healing Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Shumway, the Ancestral Healing Coach, and recording today from the ancestral lands of the Ute, Dene, and the Nauvi people here in South Central Utah, the beautiful sacred Red Rock Desert. And this episode today is focused on the ancestors, particularly around who are the ancestors that we are going to discuss more further in the ancestral healing work. And there's a lot of different information about this, and I thought it would be helpful to record a separate episode about some of these more specific principles that I find are useful as I teach people in reconnecting with their ancestors about who is it really that we're connecting with, because sometimes it's not exactly who people think about when we first hear about the work of ancestral healing. So there is a lot of work around the ancestors that we might think of as our more recent dead. And a lot of times when we're talking about ancestors, we're thinking about genealogy research and family reunions and going to a cemetery. And that is part of the ancestors that we are talking about. But there's a lot more to that. And for a long time, there's been a lot of interest building around genealogy research, family history, etc. And I grew in my profession as a professional genealogist during the height of that interest. And there is still a lot of that interest. I feel like it's cooled off in some ways. But what's also interesting is that there's been new explosions of other tangential related topics and fields around ancestors, such as intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, ancestral healing, and then even the interest in returning to more earth-based ancestral ways of living, ancestral health and diet practices. I feel like there's just a lot of different aspects of moving more into a simple earth-based relational field and bringing healing to some of the troubles that took us away from those ways of being. And I don't think that's by coincidence. As I mentioned in the previous episode, we're being called by this larger group of collective ancestors to return back into a state of wholeness, to repair the wounds of separation that we have inflicted upon ourselves, also becoming more connected to this divine energy that moves through the human consciousness and the human species at large. When it comes to relating with the ancestors, one of the things that's really important to name is that every ancient culture that I can think of has had or has practices that are meant to tend ancestral relationships. When a person dies in the community, there are practices to help that human soul transition. And then there are practices of being able to make offerings and be in relationship and seek guidance and insights and wisdom and protection from the ancestors after death. And so when we take this into account, one of the things that's really important that I want to emphasize is that it is historically normal to be in relation with the ancestors and to see them as an important source of wisdom and guidance and protection. Full stop. It's historically normal. If we look at the spectrum of human history on this planet, I can't give an exact time frame, but it's a few 100,000 years at least that Homo sapiens have been moving about. And in that period of history, it is such an incredibly small fraction that we have moved out of the practices of being in relation with the ancestors and seeing them as a real viable member of the team. And that means a lot because we have to ask ourselves, why is it that there is just such a small percentage of time that we haven't been in a relationship with the ancestors. And a lot of it comes back to this topic of separation and moving away from the earth-based cultures and traditions that Indigenous peoples have or had, if those cultures are no longer present and intact. And so as part of that separation from these different relational ways of being, we have come to this idea that ancestor relationship and reverence and worship are silly. A lot of times that's how we feel about it. And even if you're someone who has a spiritual, religious upbringing where you believe in life after death, you still may not believe that it's okay or that it's cool to relate with the ancestors in some way other than maybe just a quick little hello prayer that you can put up there. A lot of times when we look at some of the traditions around the world that are ancestral reverencing and worshiping, a lot of times we have a tendency in the West in particular to kind of poo-poo those and look at them as silly. That is a colonialistic way of thinking. That's a supremacy way of thinking when we look at Indigenous-based cultures or cultures that have more a semblance of the Indigenous roots. It is a colonialistic framework to see those as silly, superstitious, irrelevant. So just take a notice if you happen to have some of those biases and ways of looking at these practices, because that will be an important part of your own healing journey. Yes, it's healing to decolonize our minds from separating, isolating practices of Western culture and return to more life-giving, life-affirming, interconnected ways of being. So I offer that because when we can begin to relate and repair connection with the ancestral realm, it becomes a spiritual game changer. And this is really exciting. So moving into this topic of who are the ancestors, obviously, it's common for us to think about our blood lineage ancestors. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about blood lineage ancestors because that's important. It's also important to mention some other types of ancestors. One is that you may have been adopted or you may have a parent who is adopted. And so you may have biological ancestors that you don't know about, but you may also have adoptive ancestors. So that's important to name. We'll talk about how that dynamic interweaves with ancestral healing work. There are also ancestors of place, ancestors of the lands where you live. There have been human beings who have lived on those lands, most likely, anciently and historically, who tended those lands, who were in a more earth-based, earth-honoring relationship with those lands, who died and whose bones are decayed and composted and is part of the soils where you live. Those are ancestors who have important roles to play in how you relate with the lands where you live and who can be connected with and provide insight. There are also ancestors of traditions, of skills, trades, wisdom and knowledge-based systems. So there can be ancestors of science. There can be ancestors of music. If you're a musician, Beethoven, Mozart, those are ancestors of a particular lineage of knowledge base. And so when we're also thinking about ancestral relationships and connection, it's totally appropriate and valid to think about some of these other aspects where we may have deceased humans who have insight and wisdom about a particular thing that is important to us. And so as we learn to reconnect with the ancestors of our blood lineages or our adoptive family lineages, we can bring in some of the common themes and ways of relating with them. We can also bring them into connecting with other types of ancestors and use that knowledge to help enhance some of our other gifts and creative endeavors. That was something that was really cool for me as I learned that aspect of ancestral connection work. I'm not going to spend as much time on that, particularly in this episode, but it is something that I wanted to name here. And so when we circle back to the topic of blood lineage ancestors, most of the time I find that people have a visual, maybe a little family tree comes to mind where they can start to see their ancestors building out in a nice little format. Sometimes it's just, I know my grandparents and I know my great-grandparents. Sometimes people don't know much beyond that. And so the idea of ancestors can be a bit nebulous and a bit abstract to them. What's really interesting is that a lot of people, I find in Western culture in particular, can think about their ancestors and maybe they don't know names, they don't know particular details of where on the globe their ancestral lineages may originate or anything like that. They may not have real tangible information to work with when it comes to their ancestors, but they can imagine and grasp their ancestors in particular times of history that are a little bit more familiar to them. So maybe thinking about, I can picture ancestors in the 1700s in Europe. I can kind of picture ancestors maybe further back in the medieval times, or something like that. I know from my own experience that I wasn't able to picture my ancestors going back much earlier than like the medieval times. And what I've also found is that it kind of was like this ancestral amnesia of Christian versus pre-Christian time period. When I worked with clients, I oftentimes bring that to their attention and awareness. And a lot of people are like, I do that too, and I didn't even realize it. It's almost like growing up in our culture and society in the history books and in our history classes in college or high school or whatever. When we talk about the pre-Christian peoples, it's almost like they get this spin where it dovetails into that aspect I mentioned earlier of seeing indigenous cultures as these silly, superstitious, heathen, pagan, like there's all of these different words that we have equated with those kinds of cultures. And I think that has created this dissonance to where it's like othering the ancestors. We're othering these other peoples in history, like, they lived in little like stick huts and they had to go and hunt and actually gut and skin their food and wow. And they wrote on cave walls and they like danced around fires and didn't have written language. Notice some of these things that I'm saying and how they're making you feel in your body. And this is really important because we want to bring this curtain down around these ancient ancestors, because reconnecting to the earth-based indigenous cultures of your lineages, wherever they are in the globe, is such a key foundational part of the ancestral healing work. And so starting to create space in your conscious awareness of these kinds of ancestors is really important, because as we get further into the work, and we'll talk about this, those ancestors are oftentimes the ones who are going to show up to help direct the work because they had all of the magic. They had all of the knowledge of how to tend cultural systems well. They had a lot of wisdom. Sure, they didn't have electricity. Sure, they didn't have a written language. Sure, they didn't have all of the different things that we think make for a modern society and that we think are so important and necessary. There's nice things that we do have. And I think some of those things are very important for us to take into the future. So I'm not saying we need to go back and live in the Iron Age by any means, but there is wisdom that got left behind, that was lost. And so it's really important that we bring some of that knowledge back and we can then interweave it with all of the beautiful things that we have in our current day. And yeah, there's going to be some things that we do have in our current day and age that we do need to shed, or that we need to morph or transition a little bit to become a little bit more aligned in right relationship. So those are just some of the key points that I wanted to mention first before we shift again to talking about some of the key principles about the dead in general. So there's 4 things that I like to teach folks. The first is that there is some aspect of consciousness that survives after we die. Chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you are open to that, or that sits very true for you. And there are various ways different religions, different spiritual traditions, and indigenous cultures look at the human soul. It's also really important that we don't get too dogmatic about what that looks like. There is space and there is room at the table for all of these different ways of seeing it. The important thing is that there is some aspect of consciousness that survives after we die, and that can look a lot of different ways. And as you learn your own way of seeing that, that's important. But then to also hold space for those perspectives to maybe change as you learn, like, oh, this culture sees it this way. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That kind of makes sense, and it feels right in this context for me. So you might be able to find new ways of seeing the dead and the human soul after death. So that's the first thing, that there is some aspect of consciousness that survives after death. The second thing that is really important for us to understand is that not all of the dead are equally well and safe to relate with. So just because you die doesn't mean all of a sudden you wake up on the other side, whatever that looks like, and you're like, oh, I'm dead, and now everything's great, and I see everything that I need to see, and I'm now one with the divine. That doesn't happen, actually, all the time. And there is a process that we'll talk about, but not all the dead are safe and equally well to relate with. The dead are as varied and differentiated as human beings who are living. There's people that you don't want to relate to in the living world. And there's people that you're like, oh my God, I just could be with them all day. It's the same with the dead. We'll talk about that later. The third point is that the dead and the living can influence each other. Okay. So in particular regards to the blood lineage ancestors, you carry energetic connection in your energy body that is also shared with the energy bodies of your blood lineage ancestors. This is where ancestral healing can become so important. And so the dead can influence you and you can influence them. I love this concept. But it's important to just know that there is a two-way street here, that there is an interconnectedness with your blood lineage ancestors on an energetic plane. The final thing that's a key principle that I want to talk about is that the dead can change. So even if there is a soul who passes on that's in a pretty rough shape, that's maybe causing trouble and problems for the living, there is ways to help that soul change and elevate. If there are humans, not if, there are, if we think about humans who have caused a lot of harm and trouble in the world, when they die, there is karmic repercussions for the lives that they live. And there is also ways for them to change, grow, and move past the troubles that they've caused. So that's an important thing, is that the dead can change and that they can elevate in their energetic vibrancy. So I want to move back now to talk about this idea of dead who are well and not well in spirit. I like to, on a scale of 1 to 10, think about this. When I'm working with clients in the ancestral lineage healing process, we oftentimes use this phrasing of scale of 1 to 10. 1, it's a very troubled, ghosty, dead person who we don't want to be around at all. And 10, this is a very almost deistic ancestral figure who is so vibrant, so bright, so loving, so kind and benevolent and wise that we just can't get enough of them. That's the scale of range that I like to think about the dead in. And in the ancestral healing work that I teach and work in, I like to think about ancestors who are on a scale in like the 8 to 10 range as being a capital A ancestor. A capital A ancestor is someone who is energetically elevated and very vibrant. And because of the way that they have grown after their death, they have allowed themselves to become more interconnected and woven into the human collective consciousness that is part of the greater divine. And what's really important about that is when we're relating with the ancestors, those are the ones who are going to be able to tend to the healing work that's needed. We're going to talk about this in the next episode. But for the most part, what I want to emphasize is important is that when we're relating with the dead, we don't want to relate with people who are unwell. Even if it's a close relative that we want to connect with, if they're unwell, they can impact you. Okay? There's different traditions around seeing this, but basically, on a simple way of explaining this, you've heard of ghosts. Ghosts are basically unwell dead who are struggling to make sense of their reality. They are also unwell because during their life, for whatever reason, whether it was trauma that they caused or trauma that they received or false ideological teachings that they struggled with and didn't understand, or they just had severe attachment issues to earth-based possessions and relatives and such. Whatever the reason is, those dead who are unwell are still stuck and attached to the physical plane in some way, shape, or form. And those unwell dead, if they are whatsoever in connection with their own relatives, are going to draw energy off of them, even if it's not their own relatives. I can clarify that. If you ever had a haunted house, there can be ghosts stuck in that physical space who can draw energy off of the living. That's kind of how the ghosts work. They draw energy off of living humans because they're in such a state of need of something to help them feel. And they don't have all of their energy body intact to be able to do that. And so this is why it's important that we don't relate with the unwell dead. Safety is so important in my work, in making sure that my clients, as we move into the healing process, are boundaried through ritual process and protection, and also that we make relationship with these vibrant capital A ancestors to be the ones to interface with the unwell dead. And so that's a really important part of the process that I want to emphasize. And so if you have heard of other forms of ancestral healing work or ancestral connection, or you know of someone who perhaps is an ancestral medium, just know that there is important cautions around safety. We don't want to relate with someone who's unwell and then bring them into our space and then start causing some funky stuff that can happen. And that can oftentimes show up for clients. Unwell dead can impact us on a physical level. They can impact us on an energetic and emotional and a mental level. And so sometimes things that you're experiencing in your life could be because there's some funky energy in your space, and there's ways to be able to clear that space. And that's also part of the beautiful ways in which the wise, well-loving capital A ancestors can show up and can become supportive entities for us. So bringing this full circle, when it comes to the dead, we want to recognize that there's a whole range of spectrum around who's out there and who's safe to relate with or not. We want to relate with ancestors who have moved through what's called the ancestralization process, meaning that they have elevated themselves, they've grown, they've been able to let go of troubles that they carried in life, and they've been able to seat with the larger collective human dead, who is also part of the divine energy that flows within all of us. And so those are the ancestors that we relate with. And as part of the ancestral healing process, what we're doing is we're working to help heal the unwell dead and bring them into that ancestral field of higher consciousness. We're not the ones that do that. We rely on the capital A ancestors to be able to do that. So that's a little bit about the ancestors and giving you some ideas about who it is that we're working with when it comes to the ancestral healing work. We are working to heal unwell dead, but we're not relating with them. We're going to turn our attentions to the wise, well-loving ones. Most of the time, they are the ones who lived in these more ancient, indigenous, intact cultures. I love this part of the process when we get to connect with the ancestors, because there's some really cool, badass people that show up for us to help bring healing into our lineages. In the next episode, we're going to move more into the basics around ancestral healing and what is the work and what are some of the different ways that we can attend to the healing work that oftentimes piques our interest around this. So have a beautiful, bright, and blessed day, and I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. If you're being called to reconnect with your ancestors and begin a healing journey with them, I invite you to learn more about my work by connecting with me at ancestralhealing.coach. You can also subscribe to my free Substack, where I share writings, practices, and insights designed to help you find more healing and well-being through deeper connection and relationship with the earth and your ancestors. Until next time, sending you lots of love and vibrant magic.